Iran spent 40 years building an air defense wall designed to keep America out for weeks. It collapsed in hours. Not because the wall was weak, not because America had more bombs, but because every layer of that system was broken in the one order Iran could not survive. Iran spent 40 years and billions of dollars building an air defense shield that on paper should have taken weeks to tear apart. Instead, it started collapsing in hours. This was never the kind of wall people imagine when they hear the word defense. It was a wall made of electromagnetic force, built from long-range radars, layered missile batteries, overlapping coverage zones, and command systems designed to make the sky itself lethal. The Bavar 373 was supposed to be the crown jewel, a system built to reach out and destroy an aircraft long before its pilot even understood he had been targeted. Its radar architecture could scan deep into the sky, track huge numbers of contacts at once, and hand those tracks off to interceptors designed to kill at extreme distances and punishing altitudes. Beneath that upper layer sat more systems, more envelopes, more frequencies, more overlapping fire. Russian-made S-300 batteries added another tier. Domestic systems filled the lower gaps. Hardened command posts buried under rock and mountain gave the whole network resilience. Iran had not built random pieces of hardware. It had built an ecosystem, and ecosystems are always harder to break than individual weapons. That is what makes the speed of the collapse so shocking. A network like this should not have failed in a single night. Iraq's air defenses in 1991 took a prolonged campaign to dismantle, and Iran had spent years studying exactly how that war unfolded. It learned from it, adapted from it, and designed its own structure to avoid suffering the same fate. Layer after layer was intended to deny access, deny freedom of movement, and force any attacker to pay dearly just for entering Iranian airspace. If all you looked at was the equipment list, the engagement ranges, and the depth of the system, you would assume a long suppression campaign was unavoidable. But the system did not fall because America brought more explosives or because its pilots were somehow braver. It fell because America understood a principle Iran never fully solved. Not a secret gadget, not a miracle weapon, a sequence, a chain of actions arranged in the one order that made the entire wall vulnerable. And that is the point that matters most. What follows is not about guessing a classified minute-by-minute timeline. That exact order may never be public, and anyone pretending to know every launch time and every transmission is probably filling in blanks. But the physics behind how a system like this must be broken are not secret. Machines obey limits. Networks depend on communication. Radars must emit if they want to guide weapons. Defenders need time to coordinate. Once you understand those rules, the problem becomes less mysterious. It becomes mechanical. Iran's wall was powerful because it worked as a system. Search radars saw deep. Fire control radars refined the track. Missile batteries engaged. Command posts coordinated sectors. Crews acted as part of a connected structure, not as isolated teams. That connectivity was the source of the wall's strength. It was also where the first blow had to land. Before the first visible strike, before the first missile rose into the air, before aircraft began exploiting gaps, the battlefield had already started changing. In military doctrine, that is the shaping phase, the stage before open combat begins. It is not dramatic in the way people expect war to be dramatic, but it is often the part that decides whether the rest succeeds or fails. Something invisible moved first. The exact methods remain hidden, but the effect is what matters. Iran's communications and digital connectivity began to collapse. Whether that disruption came directly from American cyber operations, whether Tehran itself severed links in a defensive attempt to contain the damage, or whether both things happened together, the result was the same. The nerves were cut before the muscles were struck. That distinction matters because the wall did not physically vanish in that moment. The radars were still there, the launchers were still there, the missiles were still loaded, the crews were still sitting at their stations. But a network without reliable communications is no longer truly a network. It becomes a collection of isolated batteries, each one seeing only a fragment of the picture. A commander looking at contacts on a screen may still be able to detect, still be able to track, even still be able to fire, but he can no longer coordinate properly with neighboring sectors or higher command. He cannot confirm with confidence whether a contact is hostile, friendly, decoy, or part of something larger unfolding beyond his view. He can act, but he acts alone. And once the wall's pieces begin operating alone, the logic that made them powerful begins to weaken. Fighters waiting on the ground need orders, batteries need confirmation, command posts need reliable links. Break those links and even intact weapons begin losing value. The wall is still standing, but it is no longer thinking as one system. It is starting to fracture from the inside. That was the opening condition. and it set up everything that followed. Once communications begin failing, every defensive choice becomes slower, riskier, and less informed. A battery commander may still have missiles in the tube and a radar painting the sky, but without a functioning command network, he is no longer part of a coordinated shield. He is just one man with one slice of the picture, trying to decide whether the contact in front of him is real, whether it is bait, and whether firing now will save his sector or expose it. That uncertainty is poison in air defense, because modern networks are designed around shared awareness. Once that shared awareness starts to disappear, the same equipment that looked so terrifying on paper becomes far less effective in practice. The wall is still armed, but it has lost its rhythm. It can still swing, but it can no longer do so with the timing that made it dangerous. That is when the next phase made sense. What crossed into Iranian airspace first was not the glamorous weapon most people would expect. It was not the expensive stealth jet or the long-range cruise missile. It was something cheaper, smaller, and in some ways more dangerous precisely because of what it forced the defenders to do. Low-cost drones entered the battle space to create a dilemma, not simply to destroy targets outright. On a radar scope, they were still a threat. They might be carrying a payload aimed at a radar face, a command node, or some other critical point. Training says you do not gamble. Training says you engage. But the moment that operator decides to fire, he begins paying a price in two different ways. First, he spends an interceptor that may be worth many times more than the drone itself. Second, and more important, he has to fully activate the tracking process that guides the missile, and that means his radar begins advertising its position to any passive sensor already hunting for emissions. In other words, the act of defending himself starts turning his own battery into a visible target. That is the trap. Ignore the drone and you risk letting a hostile object reach something valuable. Engage it and you burn ammunition while exposing your exact position. There is no clean answer. The operator is not making a foolish decision. In fact, his response is often the correct one according to the rules he was trained to follow. Detect, track, fire, guide. The problem is that the battle has been designed so that his correct response is also the one that helps the attacker most. Every shot reveals. Every emission marks. Every expensive interceptor launched against a cheap drone leaves one less available for the real wave still forming behind it. This is not just about economics, though the cost exchange is painful. It is about forcing the wall to describe itself. The defender is being made to show where he is, how he reacts, and how quickly he consumes the resources that were supposed to keep the sky closed. Up to this point, though, the operation is still shaping the problem, not solving it. Breaking communications weakens coordination. Provoking batteries with drones drains magazines and forces emissions. But as long as the radars themselves remain capable of tracking and the fire control chain remains physically alive, the wall has not yet truly fallen. That is why the next phase matters so much. This is where the defender is pushed into a no-win response. The stealth aircraft entering the fight do not need to be literally invisible. They only need to compress the defender's timeline so drastically that the engagement starts running backward. A radar that might detect a conventional aircraft far out now sees something much smaller only when it is already much closer. That lost detection distance is not just lost space, it is lost time. And in air defense, time is life. If the system expects to see a target early, classify it, coordinate the response, and build an engagement solution, but instead only gets a useful look when the attacker is already deep inside the envelope, then the defender is no longer operating from control. He is reacting under pressure, inside a shrinking window. That is what makes stealth so destructive when it is combined with the earlier phases, rather than used alone. The aircraft can listen passively, collecting radar emissions without broadcasting themselves in return. That means the defenders are the ones teaching the attackers where they are. Every activated radar becomes a source of location data. Supporting electronic warfare aircraft can then intensify the confusion, flooding receivers, degrading clarity, and making already stressed operators even less certain about what they are seeing. The goal is not simply noise for its own sake. It is to reduce the defender's confidence in his own system at exactly the moment he most needs that confidence. Then comes the weapon that locks the dilemma in place. Anti-radiation missiles are built specifically to punish emitting radars. If the radar remains on, the missile homes toward that beam. If the radar shuts down, the missile still flies toward the remembered location and can finish the attack using terminal guidance. The defender is trapped. Keep the radar alive and attract the weapon. Shut it down and lose the very function you need to survive. Either way, the wall begins losing its eyes. Once that starts happening, the entire logic of the defense begins to unravel. The radars that were supposed to protect the system are now becoming liabilities. The interceptors that were meant to preserve access denial are being wasted against cheap threats or held back too long because crews no longer trust the picture in front of them. Operators are no longer fighting with confidence inside a coordinated network. They are reacting inside isolation, under pressure, and with fewer good options every minute. And all of this is unfolding inside a larger timing window the defenders cannot fully see. That is the hidden elegance of the sequence. None of these phases were meant to stand alone. They were built around a slower weapon that had already been launched long before the fight looked dramatic from the outside. Cruise missiles were already on the way. That matters because subsonic weapons do not arrive quickly. They need time to cross distance, and that travel time creates the window in which everything else must happen. The communications disruption, the drone pressure, the radar suppression, the stealth penetration, all of it was arranged so that by the time those cruise missiles reached the coast, the defensive wall that should have seen them, coordinated against them, and engaged them, was no longer functioning as a true wall at all. That is why sequence matters more than spectacle. The slowest weapon had to be launched first because it needed the longest runway. The invisible shaping actions had to come next because they softened the system before the visible pressure began. The cheap drones had to arrive before the decisive strike because they forced the defenders to reveal themselves and spend valuable interceptors. The stealth and electronic warfare layer had to follow because it exploited those emissions, found the active nodes, and suppressed or destroyed them. Only then did the cruise missiles reach the coast at the exact moment when the defenders were least able to stop them. Reverse that order and the whole chain loses its power. Launch the cruise missiles into a still-connected air defense network and they fly toward intact radars and coordinated batteries. Send the stealth aircraft too early and the defenders still have stronger communications, more discipline, and more time. Skip the drone layer and the batteries have fewer reasons to reveal themselves. Every step exists because it creates the condition that makes the next step work. That is not just operational planning. It is engineering applied to combat. Once the pathway was open, the targets behind it became vulnerable in different ways. Fixed naval facilities, command nodes, fuel storage sites, coastal bases, missile positions, and support infrastructure could all be struck according to their hardness and their value. Cruise missiles are useful because they arrive from distance with precision once the route has been burned open. Behind them, carrier aviation can bring heavier bombs against hardened shelters and larger structures, while also carrying smaller precision weapons that destroy one battery, one launcher, or one vehicle without flattening everything around it. That balance matters. Not every target needs brute force. Some need penetration, some need delicacy, some need speed, some only become reachable after the wall around them stops functioning. That is why the earlier phases were never the end state. Suppression was not the objective by itself. Suppression was the price of entry. The real aim was to make the protected target set vulnerable, to turn years of hardened planning into exposed infrastructure. And once that happened, the loss extended beyond the immediate explosions. A system like this does not just protect radars and missile trucks. It protects confidence. It protects planning assumptions. It protects the belief that deeper assets can survive long enough to matter. When that outer wall fails quickly, the damage spreads psychologically and operationally at the same time. Commanders become more cautious. Crews become less certain of what they are seeing. Units that were supposed to act under the umbrella of a functioning network suddenly discover that the umbrella is gone. Some targets can still fight back, some missiles can still launch, and some hardware can still survive, but the system no longer behaves like a system. That is the real defeat. The sequence did not have to destroy every weapon Iran owned. It only had to destroy Iran's ability to use those weapons as a coordinated whole. When a wall no longer acts like a wall, it does not matter how much steel, fuel, or electronics are technically left standing behind it. The pathway is open, and the battle has already shifted in favor of the side that understood the order of operations better. That is the lesson the world was meant to see. Iran did not lose because every launcher vanished overnight or because every missile was destroyed in a single sweep. It lost because the chain that gave those weapons meaning was broken. A radar without communications is just a machine. A missile battery without coordination is just a launcher waiting for incomplete information. A command system that cannot connect sectors is no longer command. The wall did not truly die when the first site was hit. It died when it stopped functioning as a system. That is why, weeks later, Iran could still fire missiles, but not in the same volume, not with the same confidence, and not under the same protection. The weapons were still there. The architecture that made them survivable was not. And that is what makes this sequence so important. It was not about throwing more bombs at a harder target. It was about arranging every tool in the only order that made the next tool more effective. First, weaken the command layer, then force the defenses to reveal themselves and waste their own ammunition, then blind or destroy the radars that remain, then send the heavier strike package through corridors that no longer have a functioning shield around them. Reverse any two of those steps and the wall holds longer. Skip one and the pressure on every later phase increases. The brilliance was not the violence, it was the sequencing. That is the principle Iran missed after 40 years of preparation. It studied the weapons, the aircraft, the ranges, and the platforms. But the side with more hardware does not automatically win. The side that understands dependency wins. The side that knows which layer must fall first wins. The side that engineers the right order wins. That is why this collapse happened in hours instead of weeks. Not because the wall was imaginary, not because it was weak, but because it was forced to face a chain of actions designed so that every correct defensive response also accelerated its failure. Sequence beats firepower. Order beats volume. And once a system loses the order that holds it together, even the strongest wall becomes temporary. That is the real story. Not just that Iran's defenses were hit, but that they were unraveled, piece by piece, step by step, in exactly the order required to make 40 years of preparation come apart in a single campaign. If this breakdown changed the way you see modern warfare, subscribe now. Because the side with more bombs does not always win. The side that understands the sequence does.